Nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui a te kaunihira arohe o te matau a Māui me hi kātika kia koutou me hoatu te rākau kia koe Councillor Hokianga kia tuwhera whai ai tā tātou hui i tēnei rā me te mihi whakatau mō tā tātou manuhiri. Kia ora rā.
Tēnā koe te hiamana. A ka pai kia ora tātou. Tātou katoa rā ngā kai kaunihira o ti rā, ngā kai mahi. Pe karakia i tātou, kia taki karakia. Nā koto tātou nei karakia whakataka te hau. Nā whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tōna. Kia rama kina ki ita. Kia rama taratara ki tai. E hia ki ana te ata kura. He tio, he uka, he auhu, tihei mauriora. Tihei wa mauriora I runga I ngā whakaaro taki karaki ai tātou. Kia whakawairinga tia te huarahi kei mui a tātou I ahei ana rā te whakawhitinga mai me ki nei o tēnei arotake o tēnei pūrongo kia tātou. Me te mea hoki rā ka tuku atu ngā whakaaro me ki kōrihi mai rā te takarangi nau mai e te ao haere tua te pō. Patua te kuru, patua te whao, patua te toki mai tai hao, rue kia tūaki ai au ki ringa nei ki te whare hukuku no Tangaroa. Tangaroa ua nuku taimaroa oro noa te toki nei a hine tuahuanga, kaore ko au ko rata e kimi ana hahau wana I te aua. Reira tuku whakaaro atu ki a rātau, ko ngaro I te tirohanga ka nohi ko rātau te tūtutanga o te poeku, o te para. Tā rātau wano e topu ai te moana nui a kiwa. Ke tutuki pai ai ki te ringa katau o te atua e whakapono atu ai rātau. Nō reira rā ngā hau tū, ngā hau mi o te wau tapu nui o te aroha. Oki oki tonu rā. Oki oki tonu rā me ki nei ngā wai tuki te hau tā hingi ki te ahuru mō wai roki. E oki. Huri atu rei rā te kei o rātau. Kua hinga mai nei ngā mate o taua wā o te huripari. Anika rā te aroha kua tūwhira atu rā ki ngā whānau. E mō tea ana tonu te ngākau kia rātau. Reire kia tātou te hunga ora e pēkau hia nei I ngā mahara o rātau kua hūpeke ki tua te arai. O tātou te hunga ora tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou mea koutou tini āhuatanga I te tikanga te whakaaro rā nei. Ko whaarikiriki hia mai ki mui a tātou, ki mui I te aruaru o tātou manuhiri kua eke mai nei. Ko pā mai te rongo e tahi he wai tapu tonu te whakaaro kari anō kia whakatau nei ki roto I nei wāhanga o kawa. Nō reira, tēnei ka mihi atu kia koutou whiu ka o tira I te tuahine no raukawa ki te tonga. Ko hoki mahara mai rā tō tātou nei whakapapa te hono ngā mā rei kura o tai nui ki ngā tika hungunu ka hua mai rā ko tō tātou nei tipuna a raukawa no reira. Tēnei ka mihi atu rā ki a koe o tira ko ngā kārangaranga iwi hapu maha o tō ka wai whakaheke. No reira tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou ko whakatau mai I runga I te karanga kia whakawhitinga mai me ki nei tēnei pūrongo o tātou. Ara atu ana te tae e tātou te hipa atu I te motu hake, I te rangatiratanga o te reo o ngā hapori ko ui ai koutou. Ana, ko kohia mai koutou, ko kohia mai kua rangahau, nā kua rongo koutou I te riri, I te mamai, I te pauri, ko waipuke tia nei, e para whenua mea, e whenua, ngā kāinga, ngā pāmu me pēnei nei nā, ko ngā kai ahu whenua, ko ngā kai ahu one, ara atu ana ko tō tātou nei rohe o te matau a Māui. Nō reira rā, tēnā koutou e pupuri ai I tēnei reo motuhake I ahu mai I ngā hapori. E hara o te Māori hanake, te rohe katoa. Hoi anō, ko tō koutou aronga Ara atu ana kanohi ki te kanohi pokohiwi, ki te pokohiwi. I roto i au e whakaaro me ki nei, ko koa oe te kōkō, kete te kākā ka kūkū te kereru. Ina ko tahi ana ke te reo o te ngāhere, ka tere hoha te mauri o te tai ao o te ngāhere. No reira, anika rā te mihi, whakatau atu ki āhua tau, nau mai, piki mai ki Wainganui a mātou nei, te kaunihera arohe o te matau a Māui. It's been asked of me to provide somewhat a whakamāramo explanation of the reo that I have spoken this morning. And first up, we take the opportunity to acknowledge our dearly departed who now meander among the spirits of our ancestors, in particular those who lost their lives during Cyclone Gabriel. We are under no illusion, absolute no illusion, that the mental toll, that the emotional recovery cannot be measured by time or arbitrary numbers, cannot be legislated. And the importance of your work to capture the undiluted voices of our communities impacted by Cyclone Gabriel is just as important as the need for us as a region to take on the whakatauki, kanohi ki te kanohi, pokohiwi ki te pokohiwi, face to face, a shoulder to shoulder approach, so that we as a region can move forward and give practical expression to the findings of this report. Hoi anō, I say these things with an open heart on behalf of Regional Council and humbly welcome you here into these council chambers. Tātou mā tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou. Pati kei rau. A tika tonu rā te whakaaro o tāua waiata, ko te aroha, ko te whakapono, ko te rangi Māori e anika rā te mihi whakatau ki a tātou. Tēnā tātou.
Kia ora. Kia ora.
Ati kei runga. Ki ngā rau awa, ki ngā maunga whakahi o tēnei rohe, ngā mokopuna o kahungunu, te rohe mai paritu tai atu ki tūraki rai e mihi ana. Ki ngā kāinga i karawhiua kinotia e ngā haumā takataka me ngā parawhenua mea ka mihi. Ka kato ana te ngā kauaroha o te hunga i riro i ngaro ki te pō. Haere koutou hei whetū ki te rangi. Te tia iho mai rā i o koutou whānau. Ka huri ahau ki ngā kanohi ora. Ngā waha kōrero o tēnā hapu, o tēnā marae, o tēnā taone, o tēnā hapori e mihi ana. E kore e mutu ngā mihi ki ngā tangata katoa, takitahi mai, taki rōpū mai rānei. I whai wā ki te huitahi, ki te tuku kōrero ki a mātou o tēnei pānera. Mo te manaaki i a mātou, mō koutou hoki i whakapuake whakaro mai i runga i te pauri, i te mamai, me te aroha. Nō mātou o te pai matawai parawhenua te honore, ki te āta whakarongo, ki ngā kōrero, ki ngā whiako, ki ngā mamai, o koutou o tēnei rohe, tēnā koutou katoa. Te a koe taku rangatira, nā ui tuku ngā kupu whakamoimiti te ata, ka mihi, ka mihi, ka mihi. Kia koe te tiamana e te mārei kura a hinewai, koutou koto kāhui, iaku nui, iaku rahi, iaku rangatira, koutou katoa e whakarauika mai nei tēnei rangi hira, tēnā koutou. E mihi ana tēnei mokopuna o Raukawa, o Tūwhare toa o Maniapoto ki a koutou. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora.
Nei au te pupuri ngā tini mahara e, taka koroto nei ka mawherangi au e, a mai ki a hau, taku i a ngongo ai e. Te tau tini e aroha nei au e.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ako, ki te rāku kōrero ki a koe te tiamana.
Tēnā tātou katoa. He wā pai tēnei, it would be a good time to introduce yourselves to the kaunihira before we head into the more formalities of today's meeting. Me hoa te.
Tui a te rangi e tō iho nei, tui a te papa e takoto ake nei, tui a rātou kua ngaro atu ki te pō, tui a tātou e hui hui mai nei e tēnei rā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Phil Mitchell, Taco Ingowa. I've been privileged to be the chair of the independent review panel. We're delighted to be able to make our presentation to you today. And without further ado, if I could just ask the rest of our team to introduce themselves, please.
Ko Kyle Christensen, toko ingoa, no te whanganui atara ahau, ko Te Awa Kairangi, toko awa. My name's Kyle Christensen. I'm the technical expert on the panel for flood risk and river management matters. And yeah, it's been a real privilege to undertake this mahi over the last 12 months and deliver this final report to you. So, thank you.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Taku ahi tū tata ko ngā marae o te reureu, TK tia te awa o rangi TK. Ko Raukawa, ko Tūwhare toko Maniapoto Oku Iwi, ko Bernadette Roka Arapere ahau. He roi ahau, e noho ana tōku whānau ki Wanganui te awa tupua, nō reira, tēnā koutou. My name's Bernadette Arapere. I'm a barrister and the third member of the panel. As we've all expressed, it is an honour and a privilege to have done this work and to present our report to Council today. Tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koutou katoa. It's a warm welcome on behalf of all our council and Councillor Hawke so beautifully put it this morning. We're a council of 11 councillors, but also around the table we have our tangata whenua partners. Mike here on behalf of our Māori committee is the chair, and also Tanya Hopman's behind you, the co-chair of our regional planning committee. Also Jock online from overseas. Kia ora, Jock. And also huge mihi to everyone else in the room, our staff, our exec. We also have media here with us today. Today is such an important time for us to receive the recommendations and the report itself. It's been a long year waiting for this, but all the mahi that's gone into engaging with our community, we're just thoroughly pleased to be here today to be able to receive that. So we will open up with you, Phil, to present to us the themes and the findings from the report before we move into accepting those. So we will hand it over to you. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I think the first slide probably says it all, and we all know why we're here. So if we move to the next slide, and what I'd like to briefly do is just outline what the presentation today will cover. Our presentation's in 4 parts, effectively. We thought we'd start by outlining the key themes that have underpinned the recommendations that we've made to you, to spend a little bit of time talking about the process that we've followed, and then to talk through the key issues. We don't intend to go through the 47 recommendations we've made one by one, but rather to talk about the principles and the concepts that underlie them. And then we'll circle back and summarise where we have got to. So turning to the key themes underpinning our recommendations, and there's 8 of them, and they're on the screen in front of you. The first key theme was that we believe that it's necessary to use all data and knowledge that's available, including historical information, to undertake decision-making systems and processes. Importantly, we believe it's essential to upgrade and reimagine flood management infrastructure, including new models of funding and collaboration. It's important to understand the performance of flood management systems in the so-called super design events, so that nothing is left to chance. And by super design events, we mean those events that exceed the level of service of the established infrastructure. We think it's important that the regional policy statement be strengthened to ensure that it is clear and directive, and that it's, and I've used the word loosely, enforced rigorously. It's not a matter of enforcing it in a legal sense, but to make sure that what it says is implemented in practice. We think it's important to strengthen systems and communications to ensure information provided to civil defence is accurate and timely. Very importantly, we think it's important that the inequities for mana whenua that are exposed to flood risk are addressed. We believe it's important to involve all communities in the process moving forward in order to both rebuild trust and also to enhance flood resilience. And it's important that there is the right internal resourcing and capability to implement all of the above. Just talking briefly about the review that we undertook. We, as you're well aware, we were commissioned by the Council to investigate the circumstances and contributing factors that led to the flooding that occurred during Cyclone Gabrielle. We looked at the Council's flood management schemes and programs from Wairoa to Parangaho, how each of those performed, and the decisions that the Council made during the cyclone. We've considered and recommended options to increase the region's long-term flood resilience. We did not investigate district or regional council roles and responsibilities. We did not investigate the local CEDAM responses or the recovery phase associated with the flooding. In terms of the specific details of the process, that the final output considers and recommends options to increase long-term flood resilience. It's been nearly 12 months in the making. We had a detailed terms of reference that in short required us to look at the council's flood management schemes, how each performed, the decisions made by the council during the cyclone, and to make recommendations to increase long-term flood resilience. A key part of our process was the extensive region-wide engagement involving mana whenua, affected communities and businesses, and a range of agencies and infrastructure owners. And if I could just interpolate there briefly, is that part of the reason this process has taken so long, and the reason that we went back to the council very early in the process and said we need more time, was to ensure that that engagement was both robust, meaningful, and was reflected in the final outcome in the report that's been presented to you today. We received a huge amount of information, both from the council and from what I might loosely call stakeholders in the region, of which there were numerous. I want to acknowledge the cooperation of council and council staff. I particularly want to acknowledge the fact that we were adamant that our review was independent. That's why none of you have seen any of us during the course of this exercise, and we respect the fact that we've been given the space and the time to do our work unencumbered by anybody else being involved in that process. I want to conclude this part of the process by also acknowledging and thanking the voluminous support that we have received from mana whenua, from the communities of this region at large. We're very mindful that our review is but one of the reviews that have been undertaken. We know that people have been suffering from review fatigue, and the fact that people have taken the time to engage with us while at the same time they're trying to rebuild their lives and their livelihoods is something that we, won't forget, and for which we're immeasurably grateful. And I would say that those inputs have actually formed the framework in many ways of the recommendations that we've made for you today. So I'd now like to just pass over to Kyle so he can talk to some of the more technical and detailed nature of some of the review aspects. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Phil. So I'm going to talk briefly about the key issues that I've found from examining the core technical functions and assets of the Regional Council. And I've grouped this into three categories. The first one I'm going to talk about is structural works, and when I'm talking about structural works, I'm primarily referring to stop banks. I'm going to talk about river management activities, so that's largely gravel extraction, willow maintenance, and river mouth openings. And I'm also going to talk about event management and specifically the Regional Council's role in event management. So to start off with structural works, and I'm talking about stop banks here, this was an extraordinary flood. This wasn't just a flood that happens all the time. This was a 1,000-year flood on many of the region's rivers, and when you have stop banks that are designed for a 100-year level of service, the inevitable outcome is that those stop banks will be overtopped and breached. And that played out most significantly on the Hiratonga Plains with numerous breaches of the stop bank system there. It also breached the Waipawa River stop bank system, and also the stop bank and drainage system at Whirinaki. An interesting sort of observation is that not all of the rivers of the region have stop banks, but in the immediate aftermath and the feedback we got, everyone wants stop banks. But the response to that is, well, the Hiratonga Plains had stop banks and there was still catastrophic flooding. So one of the key lessons for sort of moving forward, and one of the key issues, is that stop banks only perform up to a certain level. And it was the fact that there hadn't been a lot of thought or planning into what happens when those levels get exceeded. Where does the water go? What can we do when a flood bigger than the design standard overtops those banks? And part of that is to do with how the stop bank systems are set up, and particularly the Hiratonga Plains. And I refer to it as a legacy system because it was dreamt up in the late 1800s, generally in terms of its arrangement, and then constructed in the 1930s. And to try and sort of wind your mind back to what the land use was of the Hiratongan Plains in the 1930s, it was perfectly adequate for protecting rural land up to a certain level of service. You bring that forward to the current day, and the level of assets and infrastructure and risk is very much different, but the stock banking system hasn't evolved a great deal. And that's why I sort of refer to a legacy system as something that was dreamt up and constructed and has been updated somewhat since then, but yeah, questioning whether that is still fit for purpose. And one of the key limitations of any stock bank system is the uncertainty that arises from when a flood larger than the capacity. And this is particularly so if the stock bank systems are at the same level. So if you have 100-year stock banks on either side, when a flood bigger than that comes, you don't know where it's going to go. Is it going to go left or right? It's completely unknown. And that leads to a very problematic situation for the Hiratonga Plains, which I'll go into more detail when talking about advice for evacuations. One of the other key findings that we made was the incorporating the knowledge of past flood events. And some of these, or many of these rivers, this wasn't the biggest flood on record, or it was, on par with other floods that have occurred over the past 100 years, and most notably 1938 in Esk. And that is reasonably recent in terms of, a memory of a flood. There's a big stone monument out there with a level. There's references in documents about how big that flood was. That flood was, the 1938 flood was potentially slightly bigger than Cyclone Gabrielle, but it was not incorporated into the flood hazard modelling, mapping, or the design of the Whirinaki stock bank scheme. So not incorporating those events means we're not really learning those lessons from the past, and we have an expectation that the design flood is actually smaller because we're choosing to ignore something that's a physical, measured experience from that catchment. So that's a very significant issue. Another particular factor was stock bank alignment and features on stock banks. So the failure at Walker Road was at least partially attributable to the alignment of the stock bank, which came perpendicular to the river channel at that location. The numerous failures particularly on the Ngāraroto River, were around where there was access tracks or guide banks, other structures that are interacting with that main stock bank. So that was also a factor. And I think this image really clearly explains the issue with having, relying on this legacy system where there's no certainty about how it would perform in a big flood. So you can see here there's red marks showing breaches. So, the system is breaching in numerous places. And the only thing that you can say with certainty about how this will perform is it will start failing from the upstream end because the flood wave is coming from upstream. So it's finding the first point of weakness. So if we're coming down the Tutaikuri, the first points of weakness are Dartmoor and then Motio. And then it's out and flowing, and then it's sort of coming down further. The next point of weakness on the Tutaikuri, Waiheke, because it has a lower standard than Taradale. There's a 500-year standard for Taradale, 100 for Waiheke. That water is now spilling into the middle, flowing through Omahu, filling up the Kowhai. And it was this sort of type of situation where and this is an uncontrolled breach through Motio, it's not of a particular size or design standard. If that had been slightly smaller, and that's just the natural way that the stock bank breached and opened up, if it had been slightly smaller, then more water would have been in the river, and the Taradale bank would have overtopped by more and potentially failed, and waters through Taradale into Napier. So I'd say it's more luck than any sort of specific management that led to the outcome that we had. And if that situation had arisen that, it's out at Taradale and then through Napier, or likewise there was a massive breach out through Hastings, it would have been order of magnitude worse in terms of consequences. But as it was the communities on the inside of the stock banks, Motio, Waiheke, Omahu, and Pakowhai that suffered the most because that's where most of the water went. So, yeah, just sort of looking at that, and it's like there was some awareness that, this system was configured in this way. There was numerous breach scenarios. It could breach anywhere. And once you considered that, it was the whole floodplain that was at risk, or Napier, Taradale, Hastings. So, and this leads into how this directly relates to the practicality and feasibility of having emergency management to manage that risk. So, okay, if you've got the system configured in this way, you want to sort of press the big red button and say we're going to evacuate the plain. That's 100,000 people. Where are they going to go? How are they going to get there with numerous sort of bridges and other sort of constraints in transport? It's close to an impossible task. So I'll talk about that more in the event management bit. Coming back to structural works in particular, and the lack of structural works in some areas, and Wairoa was a particular community that stood out as having a high exposure to flood risk, having experienced numerous floods in the past, and particularly Cyclone Bowler. And there was a scheme developed in terms of stop banks and river control works to reduce that risk. But there was not sufficient funding to progress those works. And it's only after Cyclone Gabrielle that funding has been provided by central government. And we considered that that was one of the key barriers to actually implementing these types of schemes, was a reliance on local funding. It's just simply not affordable if you're going to try and use existing funding mechanisms to make the local communities pay for all or a lion's share of these types of work. It has to be spread regionally and nationally, and Phil will talk about the funding a bit later on. So within that context, across the region, the structural works, and particularly new structural works that are being proposed, because there's a number of communities that are like, well, we want our stop banks, but you need to heed the lessons of this event and the stop bank systems when thinking about these new stop bank proposals. And the new designs, they have to provide a predictable and manageable performance in floods that are bigger than what the stop banks can take. Having stop banks all at the same level and not knowing where it's going to go just leads to very problematic event management and residual risk management issues. And the overarching design or sort of thinking around this, and this is an evolving best practice in New Zealand and across the world, is this idea of making room for rivers, allowing rivers to spread their water out into diversion channels, spillways, wetlands, storage areas. So you're not trying to confine them and make the water deep, because that leads to a very high risk type of environment. We're trying to spread water out, lower the risk, have it in a very controlled and manageable fashion from when it reaches the top of the floodplain until it gets to the sea. We need to know where that water is going to go and how it's going to get between point A and point B safely. And if we need to move some people out of the way temporarily, so be it. But we know that in advance, and we can do that safely with good warning systems. I'm now going to go on to the second general topic of sort of technical river management, and is river maintenance. A lot of feedback we had from the community was to do with gravel extraction, increased bed levels, river mouth openings, and willow maintenance. And we did thoroughly look at the survey, analysis, and work that the Regional Council has been doing to measure and manage the gravel resource, and as well as managing willow growth in channels. And there were certainly some areas where the riverbeds were higher than the design grade lines. But in an event of this scale, the actual amount of water in the river channel is only part of the picture. It's spread out onto the berms, onto the floodplains. So what's going on in the channel has lesser importance than a smaller flood. And the other thing to think about is that in a flood of this size, the whole riverbed is mobilised. So it's not like you look at the survey from before the flood and that's what's going to exist during the flood. The whole riverbed is going to be like a movable fluid because of the size of this flood. It's going to be eroding and transporting an enormous amount of gravel in the big gravel bed rivers. The other thing to think about is that the cyclone itself has caused massive changes, and there is certainly a process of resurveying and understanding what those changes are in terms of bed level changes, deposition on booms, and what remedial works are required to return those systems to the agreed levels of service. We also found that there was some, the readiness and ability to respond to an event of this scale across the whole region meant that the regional council resources and backup systems were stretched. So this was in terms of diesel generators and diesel supply and staff to man pump stations and to make sure they were functioning. But also noting that this was far beyond the design standard for many of those systems, but the actual resource available and able to access some of those systems was also hampered. The third area which I'm going to talk about is event management. So this is looking at the core function of regional council to provide accurate and timely advice on forecasting flood flows and providing advice to civil defence. And I'll make it crystal clear that it is the advisory part of the regional council's responsibility. We're not talking about, who said what in terms of evacuations or warnings. It's more the advisory role that the regional council fulfills. So in terms of that, and for that to be effective, the community needs to know and understand what flood risk they face. And in many cases, there was very limited understanding from the communities that they were living somewhere that was at risk. And they had limited access or knowledge to being able to get any of the information themselves about how big was the flood that was coming. Were we going to get inundated? There was very limited access to that information. And there was also very limited planning and processes for trigger levels for areas of known flood risk. And also, as I mentioned before, not including past known significant flood events like 1938 and Esk, also reduced the level of risk awareness and preparation in some areas. And as I've said earlier, in terms of the structural works, the way that the Hiratonga Plains system was, as it's formed, leads to a fairly unpractical and just unmanageable evacuation scenario for civil defence to consider 100,000 people in short time to remove off the plains. With that sort of context, there was also a number of things that happened specifically during this event. There was under forecasting of the rainfall that was coming from Met Service, so the regional council relies on that information to make forecasts. As well as that, a number of the HBRC systems, rainfall gauges, river flow monitoring stations were physically washed away or damaged by the event. A key repeater station, which was sending data back to the regional council, was out of service during the event because of numerous backup systems that failed. So there was issues with the data and with the actual sort of technical information that was being used, and some of the language used from regional council in providing advice had a degree of uncertainty about it. So it was maybe at risk, could be similar, and there was in some cases, sort of optimistic presentation of information, or sort of hoping for the best rather than preparing for the worst. Type of approach in some instances. And I think that one of the main things to highlight was the scale of this event overwhelmed the regional council resources. This wasn't just looking at one river in flood, it was looking at every river in the region in a flood that was, if not one of the biggest, or the biggest that river had ever experienced. So that's a very short sort of summary of what has been sort of 12 months of sort of picking the story together. But I'll hand over to Phil to talk about the planning controls aspect.
Thank you, Kyle. Obviously, the council has many roles and responsibilities in undertaking its business, and in addition to being an infrastructure provider and manager, it's also got a key role in policy making and planning in the resource management space. And key in that regard is the council's regional policy statement. It has pretty far-reaching effects in that it's required to be given effect to in district plans, and those district plans then dictate what development in a land use sense can occur and where it can occur. And I think the bottom line is that for whatever reason, the regional policy statement didn't provide directive enough provisions that ended up allowing development to occur in locations where it should not have. And we've noted on the screen there that two examples are Tangoio and Esk, but there are others. And the one that's sort of most front of mind for me, I think, is the Hukarere Maori Girls Boarding School that relocated to the Esk Valley relatively recently. And when you look at what happened and sort of try and reconcile that with how it was allowed to happen, you sort of scratch your head a little bit. As Kyle has said, and I don't think I need to say any more, the future planning regime must address the scale and magnitude of historic floods and include data even if it's not complete. But more fundamentally than that, the RPS needs a substantial refresh and change in emphasis in our view, so that it's more directive and less vague and leaving less discretion to others to make their own decisions, if I could put it that way. We think that the council needs to be better resourced to take an advocacy role in land use planning and consenting processes. That is to ensure that the regional policy statement is implemented appropriately. And by that I mean when district plans are being developed, we think it's important that the council is active, this council is active in making sure that the regional policy statement is properly given effect to. And even when someone comes along and says, well, notwithstanding all of the planning regime, I want to pursue a development in this location, the council does have the resources and the prioritisation that mean that there is resource able to be focused on that. And finally, one of the matters of detail is that we think that the regional plan, as opposed to the regional policy statement, should provide more specific guidance about the design of structures and riverbeds. And the obvious example of that is bridge structures. There were a number of failures in close proximity to bridges. The bridges with the piles that support the deck act as barriers, debris traps, so on and so forth. And things like ensuring that there are appropriate design standards to minimise the blockage of the channel, to perhaps ensure that the deck is sufficiently located above the floodplain, are all the sorts of things that we think warrant some further investigation. So there's only a short slide on this. We are mindful of the fact that the RPS is in the process of being reviewed, and that's obviously a good thing. We would just like to think that the recommendations that we've made in relation to that provide some impetus in that regard, so that the new RPS is not just a refresh, it's a fundamental relook. Thank you, and pass over now to Bernadette.
Thanks, Phil. As a panel, we were privileged to hear the kōrero tuku iho, so the handed down kōrero, the lived experiences and the mamae of mana whenua, and to visit marae, awa and whenua and receive that kōrero at place was an honour and very much informed our report. We consider that mana whenua were disproportionately impacted by the flood. There are several examples throughout the region of marae, Papakainga and Urupa being located on marginal floodplain land in close proximity to rivers that were catastrophically inundated during the flood. There are a number of examples, but Tangoio, Petane, Omahu are three that spring to mind at this moment. The pattern we observed was that land currently occupied by many Māori communities is often the last remaining land of much larger holdings that they held prior to Pākehā occupation. And in many places there were known flood risks at these locations and no structural defences to provide management of that risk. This situation clearly presents a challenge or challenges to mana whenua when such lands are no longer safe to live on. Reflecting then on the unique circumstances of Aotearoa New Zealand, a key challenge is how to apply the technical principles that Kyle has spoken about, working in partnership with mana whenua. We received feedback of a disconnect between some mana whenua groups and the Regional Council. The perception was that the Regional Council does not protect mana whenua communities in the same way that other communities are protected against flood risk. The example there that I can think of is Waiohiki, Papakainga, which was severely flooded, while Taradale was protected by a high stock bank. There are many examples throughout the rohe. We encourage the Regional Council to recognise and provide for Māori communities and lower socioeconomic areas that are disproportionately exposed to flood risk. We recognise that the iwi Partnerships Group at the Council are active in advising you as councillors, and that there are a number of committees and advisory groups with mana whenua representation. But we consider that more work needs to be done to partner with mana whenua at a governance level. So kanohi ki te kanohi, pokohiwi ki te pokohiwi, rangatira ki te rangatira. We consider that inequities between mana whenua and other Hawke's Bay communities need to be acknowledged, and a new flood management model needs to be developed with mana whenua for a safe and sustainable future. We consider that mana whenua knowledge and participation is fundamental to managing future flood risk. Turning then to other parts of the community, we met with many community groups, many that sprung up in the wake of the cyclone. We met with business, we met with infrastructure providers, a huge range of groups in the community. We were amazed by the stories shared with us by all communities about the selfless actions of individuals, of whānau, of whole communities during and after the flood, and that will stay with us. From these discussions, it was clear that there was a range of perspectives on the extent to which Regional Council works with communities in relation to flood management, planning and recovery. A persistent theme was a lack of meaningful engagement, and that local knowledge and perspectives were not always seen by the Regional Council as being useful. We consider that the Council should make better use of the networks and knowledge that exist within communities. It will be essential that the Regional Council treats the region's communities as project partners, rather than consulting or seeking feedback once much of the critical thinking has already occurred. You'll all be aware there's considerable momentum in the community now, and we encourage you to make the most of this momentum, to learn the lessons from this event and to develop new and improved flood risk management solutions. Again, we consider community and stakeholder participation to be fundamental to managing flood risk in this region. I'll come back to you now, Phil.
Thank you. I guess at the risk of stating the obvious, it's all very well for us to make a series of recommendations to you, but the reality is that they require sufficient funding in order to be implemented. And that is clearly a challenging issue, and as you are well aware, there's no silver bullet. The three aspects that we have focused on are on the screen. The first one is resourcing and funding associated with capability and capability building. And we formed the view that resourcing needs to be sufficient to deliver the agreed level of service for business as usual operations, and that the Council has sufficient backup and contingency plans to meet its flood event management responsibilities. The second one is partnership funding, and we believe the Council should be proactive in working in partnership with central government to ensure sustainable funding for river management, flood resilience and event management occurs, and we are aware of initiatives in that space, and you'll be more familiar with those details than we are. But I think it's fair to say there is still considerable work to be done in implementing the sorts of recommendations that we have made to you today. The final point is about ensuring equitable outcomes, and Bernadette touched on that earlier. We think it's important to review the funding of current and future river management schemes so that the targeted and regional rates contributions enable affordable and equitable outcomes for all communities, including and in particular mana whenua. And just in case there's any ambiguity about what we're saying in that regard, we think that the conventional model of not protecting vulnerable communities because the rates return or the ability for those communities to fund that protection is just not appropriate going forward, and we think that requires a fundamental rethink. And I think that's why this partnership approach that we have alluded to throughout this presentation and throughout our report is so fundamentally important. So that brings us to a summary, and for those of you that have good memories, you'll see that that summary page is the same pages that we had at the start of the presentation that outlined the key themes. So I don't intend to take you through all those again. So I think I'd say in closing that the future is clearly going to be challenging for this council and for this region. We hope sincerely that our recommendations meet with your expectations. We're confident that they meet the expectations of the communities that we have consulted with and who have engaged meaningfully with us, and we just commend those recommendations to you. I'd like to close again by acknowledging the contribution that the communities of this region have made to our review. Mana whenua have been instrumental in that regard, as have the wider communities and stakeholder groups in the regions. And as I said at the outset, the framework for our recommendations has been heavily influenced by the kōrero that we have had with the regional community in the widest sense. So I thank you for your time today, for listening to us. We wish you happy reading and considering the detail of our report. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou te puari kia koe Phil te tiamana. Hei māngai ngā whakaaro o te hapori o te rohi nei. We thank you so much for the taonga that you are giving to us, the way in which you've undergone a very hard process, which I expect you hearing these experiences and stories yourself, you've taken that on your shoulders to deliver to us today. I'd also like to thank you for the way in which you've worked to be completely independent, to be completely engaging and inclusive of our communities and those impacted. And for me, what's very striking is that the way that we have done things in the past is not fit for purpose for the future. And these are now mokopuna decisions for us to make, and you've shone a light very openly, which we have asked you to, very transparently, on what improvements we need to make and the valuable improvements for us to work through. So I will stop there and ask each of our councillors to make comment and acknowledge the mahi, the work that you've put in and what you are providing to us today before we end this item more formally. Kia ora.
Chair,
Councillor Williams.
in that regard, can I move recommendations 1 to 5, including thanks to the panel, and then speak to that and giving my comments?
Thank you.
I'll
Can I
get a
just-
second, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Foley. Councillor Williams.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. In fact, you said it in a very concise way. I'm extremely grateful, as I think our communities would be, for the straightforward way that you presented that overview. And from what I've seen of it, you've set out the report, delivered in a way that our communities can digest. Chair, fellow councillors, this is the report, as was the review itself, that our community demanded and deserved. It's a thorough, robust, frank, and even brutal independent assessment of the performance of the organisation's flood protection schemes, and perhaps revealing the misnomer in that very word protection during Cyclone Gabriel. And I think with this report, Chair, we've turned a page. We can acknowledge and learn from the past as we forge ahead to the next chapter in terms of this region's flood resilience in a world of increasing cyclone dysfunction. And as you've said, Chair, that which was fit for purpose in the 20th century is no longer, and that is the key lesson of this report. And I think that's particularly as to how, Kyle, you shared, we plan for, if you can, it's almost an oxymoron, for super design events that just weren't in the frame when these schemes were built in the 60s and 70s and 80s, with no spillways or ponding areas and no predictable areas of flood conveyance out of harm's way. That's an inevitable legacy outcome of these schemes, which, when they fail, whereas we as an organisation are seen to fail as well. So, just to conclude, can I say this report, as well as no doubt being the page turner that I referred to, if you'll forgive the pun, is a platform for a conversation with our communities region-wide, Wairoa, Central Hawke's Bay, Narororo, Heretaunga and Ahuriri, and we will continue to partner with the communities in that conversation, because the challenges are immense and they will require a scale of imagination and investment that hasn't been seen in Aotearoa before, and is beyond even the unprecedented scale of the 250 million of NEWI funded works that we're rolling out in the next 3 years. So thank you to our communities for engaging, mana whenua in particular. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Chair.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Foley.
Thank you, Chair. And just to follow up on Councillor Williams there, thank you so much for the report and being here today. It was such a pleasure listening to you then, and I think to be thankful for the clarity of the way you presented and what you presented. Obviously, a common theme there is around the legacy of, what we've got, how far back it was designed for, and looking forward. It's just a subtle difference, I think, about, when we go forward, what it is that we do to improve and upgrade. But I think probably the thing that touched me the most there was how you acknowledge the communities. At the end of the day, that's who we are here representing. And so thank you very much for acknowledging them. They're the ones out there at the coalface, and they do have a lot of local knowledge and ideas and opinions, and that's what we get all the time. So it was really refreshing to hear that, you were right there with them and felt that too. So thank you very much.
Kia ora, Mike.
Kia ora koutou. Yes, I take the point of, it's, we've had a 1,000 years of history there where there's been continuous flooding over the Heretaunga Plains, given that it's a floodplain. So we should not be surprised that we have witnessed the flooding that we have. We have planned, designed and engineered to drain those plains into the waterways and streams of the Heretaunga and the wider Hawke's Bay. So why should we be surprised when we get a extreme weather event that all the water that we've engineered to channel into those streams and waterways struggles to cope with those copious amounts that we haven't even planned for? I take your point, Kyle, that it was a matter of luck as to who got flooded and who didn't. Would your report have been the same if it was Hastings that was completely flooded out? Or was it Napier completely flooded out? Would the report be the same? I'm not quite too sure, to be honest, because the results would have been different in regards to the size of the impact, not only on the individuals, but on the wider community itself and the region. I also agree with the challenge that we have in front of us. It is huge. It is huge. What is required to be done to start to turn things around in regards to how do we manage what are becoming more frequent 500-year events on almost on a 10-year cycle to a certain degree. We've seen Wairoa, in the space of a couple of years, flooded twice. So we have to turn our thinking around. What we took to be the status quo is no longer the status quo. And I think the biggest challenge that's out there is what you mentioned, Phil, is how the hell do we pay for it all? We've just gone through our long-term plan and just the angst over that without even coming near adding what it's going to cost us to bring about these changes. And yes, we can partner with central government, but who's that? The taxpayer. Who's council? The ratepayer. Still going to the same household. So I think not just for Hawke's Bay Regional Council, but for council and government, what are our priorities going forward? Because I think that's where we have got to go to. What are the priorities for our region going forward? Where do we put our energies? Where do we put our resources? Kia ora tātou, I'll leave it there, but great work. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Councillor Curtin.
Thank you, Mike. And I'd like to add my, if you like, congratulation to the panel for an exceptional report. And I want to pick up on my colleague, Councillor Hawke, in his observation that the report presented an undiluted voice for all of those catastrophically affected by the event. I want to add that the report also captured their pain, and I want to add also that I think this is something you won't have anticipated as a consequence of your report, and that's its enduring nature. The report itself, and for report geeks such as myself, provides an absolutely comprehensive overview from start to finish and from left to right. The report contains, and I thank Carl for his contribution in it, a level of expertise and analysis that will prove invaluable as we go forward. The summary in terms of our policy settings from the chair are exceptionally valuable, but also the contribution from Bernadette in terms of the observations of mana whenua are resounding. Why I say it's enduring? I've been on this council for 2 decades. I'm the longest serving councillor here. One of the things that worries me and has worried me is, if you like, the voice being heard throughout the organisation and this organisation responding accordingly. This document provides that endurance. It provides both the people affected the opportunity to wave it in front of future councils and to say, what have you done about that? What responses have you made? And this, to me, gives us that guidance that will endure for at least a decade, hopefully 2 decades, as we reset, rebuild and reconfigure protecting our community. And clearly we had a blind spot. Clearly we possibly couldn't see the wood for the trees in terms of that impact that was inevitable, really, when, as you so appropriately observed, Carl, the evidence was clearly in front of us. We didn't plan for the eventuality, and now we must. Finally, I want to comment, and something that resounded with me, Bernadette, was the impact on mana whenua. It concerns me, and I think we need to take that note on board, because we have those circumstances right here, right now, in our city where Māori predominate in our Maranui suburb, Piramai suburb, etc., and we must make much stronger efforts to protect those communities equally. That's not a fact at the moment. They face that exposure, and I'm glad that I'll be able to wave your words, this document, in front of my fellow councillors at every opportunity, as they already know, to say we must act and protect our most vulnerable communities. Thank you so much.
Kia ora, Councillor Curtin. Councillor Sees.
Kia ora, Chair. Kia ora tātou. Yes, thanks from me too. I don't need to repeat the thank you to the panel on the quality of work. That's evident. But we've been waiting, of course, waiting for this report, because there's always a sense that once the report comes, somehow you've got to the end of something. And, of course, receiving the report's the opposite, because it takes you straight back into the experience. And knowing about flooding is one thing, but living through it or waking up in a river is entirely different once there's an experiential relationship to a disaster or an event. You never see your river in the same way again. That's my personal experience too. And the voice from the community was really clear at the beginning. Build more stop banks, build them. Why aren't you building? Why are you putting them back? Why can't they just be bigger? And this desire as we have as humans to somehow feel safe from nature, that somebody else can make things and do things and make us safe from the natural environment is just, I think, inherent in us as people, certainly as parents, to want to protect. And what the report for me has so clearly put out there, which we actually all know, is that that's not possible. Bigger, stronger, higher stop banks aren't the answer to this. The report has made so clear the way we live with the over-design events, or the way we live with nature, has to be reimagined. That our community you make it so clear even in your summary, the community is unaware of the risks. We just don't want to be aware of them. To live with that uncertainty can be very uncomfortable. So I'm really pleased to see such clear direction around the nature-based solutions and the room for rivers. We were having those conversations very early into council when we first arrived before Cyclone Gabrielle. We know those are the future. We've been talking about those for the last 18 months. So to see that clearly put there in the report to steer us that way was excellent for me. So thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor Rodley.
Kia ora, Chair. Thank you to you all for this this taonga that will take us forward. And while we obviously haven't had a chance to unpack it completely, what is really obvious is, whilst there are huge challenges ahead for our region, this is an opportunity for us to really rethink and reimagine how we work with our communities, how we embed their knowledge, how we value what they bring to the table, to our expertise, and also for our communities to take responsibility and feel that they are listened to and share in those risks, understand those risks, and make decisions about their own lives and their own places that they live in, their own waterways, their own rivers, so that they are fit for purpose, that they know what those risks are and live their lives in a way that keeps them safe. So we really value what that will bring, sharing those risks, how we work with our communities, and personally I find it really energising that we actually have this ability to do this, and I think this council table is up for that. In fact, we are excited, well, I'm excited by it, so thank you for bringing that to us.
Kia ora, Councillor Roden. Councillor Harding.
Kia ora, Chair, and kia ora to the three of you sitting up there, but also to the people that stood behind you to help you prepare that report. I recognise some familiar faces in here today. Look, this report's a gift, a great gift, and it's the gift not only of a comprehensive list of actions of areas where council can improve, but the prime gift is that reimagining, the impetus, the necessity to reimagine our flood protection. And as fellow councillors have mentioned, this is something that's been on our minds already, but it is such, you cannot understate the size of that challenge, and that the only way you can do that is to work really closely with the community. Because, and this is possibly the reason why we find ourselves in this situation at the moment of having actively not made decisions, is because that involves trade-offs, and some land will have to be designated to flood in future if the system is to work. And we cannot, as a council, regulate for that. The only way we can successfully achieve that is through community outcomes. So that vision that you've given us is unimaginably wealthy. It's the best thing you could have done. So I thank you deeply. Thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Councillor Lambert.
Ia, kia ora koutou. Ai, ngā mihi, kia koutou mō koutou mahi. Ko te hua, kia hau nei, ko te reo, ko te waha o a tātou hapori, iwi, rātou katoa. So yeah, thanks very much for this. It's good to see someone finally call a spade, and inequity, there's no other way to put it. And I would add that our people live where they live because that's the last bit of land left to them. So it has been not just a legacy of playing with the rivers, it's also a legacy of inequities. So, the fact that the council does run on funding, though, does pose a big, huge problem. Where we're going to need, as Zane's probably put it best, we need our communities on side as well. But yeah, more importantly, your local government or central government is going to have to come on board. The inequities aren't just as a result of what's been going on here, obviously. So I feel for our communities of Wairoa, Tangoio, Porongahau, all along the Takutainei, because we know that these things have been a while coming. I am astounded, Kyle, that you put it so simply. Why haven't we planned for the super design? We do plan for 100-year flood. We hear it all the time, or the 1 in 500. Yeah, but what happens when that doesn't work? That seems such a simple idea, and yet, I think that's what makes the fact that it's an independent review so telling, is that you come up with such simple solutions, and when I guess our lens is really diluted by protocols and processes like the policy statement, which is not effective enough. Stuff. Some of that's outside our control, but we think it's outside, but it isn't really. So, yeah, thanks very much. And the lens is a lot wider. Yeah, and thanks for listening to our people. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Councillor Van Beek.
Yeah, good morning, Jeff from Make. I'm the representative of most of the people on the Aratonga Plains that were affected, and hence I was personally very much affected as well. And I'm not sure where my thank you will go because it could become emotional. But anyway, definitely not as affected as some of the people that you have spoken to. But at the same time, I thank you from the bottom of my heart and for my family for this report. I accept it on behalf of our community because this report, the way you've written it, is not actually for us. It's actually written for our community, how they can read it And although it's a page turner, as it's been said before, to me, the physical thing is actually it will turn a corner. What we will do as a Hawkesbury Regional Council. When I finally was able to meet with my community during very difficult meetings that we had where people were standing up and screaming and waving fists and being really angry, I was able to speak up and calm them down somewhat, and understanding that we're in this together and we as a council will work to the best of our ability to find solutions. And as Councillor Sia said and others have said, raising stop banks is not the solution. And that was sort of in late March when I spoke to the communities, when I finally got myself out of the silt and out of the rubbish. And I explained it this way: if you want to create a dam to make power, you build it as high as you can, because that creates energy. If you do have a stop banks, you get the same result. And I'm the result of that energy, and so are you. And they understood that, and they sat down and continued to listen to myself, my fellow colleagues, and our staff. And so I think the very clear and concise report that you've given us is in that language, and they will understand that this is what we need to do as a community together and in partnership together. Myself, as you can hear, I'm possibly one of the few Kiwis with a Dutch accent. I was born on a floodplain. I'm a floodplain baby. That's how I always opened my discussion. Listen, guys, I'm a floodplain baby. I know how it works. If the river starts to rise, my father would move all the stock and all the machinery and all the pumps and everything that he could, put it on the farming platform that was higher. Our farm would be flooded, and then we would carry on. And that was a regular occurrence for us and me as a boy. But also in the community right across our country, because we have learned to live with water. Unfortunately, we didn't have a plan B, but with the help and the extreme foresight and knowledge that you have put on paper here, we now have, I believe, a making of a plan B. And I'm possibly even as brave to say that we have to learn to live with flooding, but we can live with flooding. And in Egypt, the flooding was actually their advantage, because actually they had a very fertile plain. You take that flooding away, that happened when they built the dam, and that all disappeared. So, and at the same time, I had a huge hole behind our orchard and house. By the way, I'm still living in a garage at the process of rebuilding our house. There was a huge hole, and I often took people to it. A couple of the politicians, I won't name names, came to talk to us and ask, because they could get to us. And I showed them this hole because I had all these layers of different flood events. And I said to them, I'm not angry at the flood that happened. My prosperity is because of these floods. But we need to manage it going forward. And that's what I ask of you. And once again, thank you very much. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor Van Beek. Kia ora, Councillor Hokianga. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou. Kua mihi ki ahau i ngā mihi. Tautoko rawa ahau i ngā kōrero. O hune hoa mahi o ngā kai kaunihira o tira tai atu rā ki tō tātene pāpā Mike. Me ana kōrero, kupu kōrero, me ki nei tāria te wāka mohio ai tātou. Whitu te kau ngā whakatipuranga mai a rangi rawa ko papa. Kare kore, whitu te kau ngā whakatipuranga mai te heke mai nei. So just reiterating Papa Mike's kōrero around the intergenerational experiences, and I just stated there in Te Reo Māori that there's 70 generations in the whakapapa, in the genealogy between the primordial parents, Ranginui and Papa Tuanuku, to us here that carry the DNA, in accordance with the Māori worldview on these things, and we will continue to build on the next 70 generations. And it's what we do. It's what we do with every child that's going to make a difference. because every child, every generation is born of magic. And we have to recognise in the way that you have been able to capture those voices the immense amount of trust that has gone into sharing with you, and in most instances, absolute strangers. And it's that level of trust that you've been able to collate those voices and now hand them over to us, where in recent years that trust in us has been challenged. And so with your independent view, review and report, we need to give our communities the confidence that we will also trust and respect their views, the historical views, the community knowing or the community intelligence, the intellectual knowing, and the experiential knowing, as Papa Mike has raised in the last 100 years. And we've heard that come through with your reference, Kyle, to Whirinaki and to the valley. I think through the Te Ao Māori view, and you probably have picked that up in your engagement with mana whenua, and I totally support the previous comments of our councillors, and then calling it what it is. And one of the things that sort of rests on me at this stage is the fact that we need to have a better relationship with our environment. It's the personalities of of the very environment that we interact with that were once perceived to be our kaitiaki. Those that looked after us was the environment itself. Somewhere along that timeline, we have changed that. And we are using terms like safety in our relationship with the environment. And I think it's important for us to do better with our relationships with the environment, so that our relationship with our mokopuna, or those yet to be born, can be an enduring one, can be a trusting one, a respectful one, and a one that when our time comes, that we can walk into the afterlife with a clear conscience that we have done our best in the time that we have been given. And so the pace in which we need to give absolute practical expression to the findings and to the voices of our communities is somewhat dictated by the pace in which the environment is going to allow us to move. O reira rā, koutou, tātou, tēnā tātou, I rungi I te whakaaro nui. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Councillor Hokianga. Councillor McIntosh, are you still with us online?
Yes, look, I am still with you. We've had a power failure here, so you can't see me. It's all black.
Ka pai. Would you like
Look,
to
I just
comment?
wanted to endorse.
Carry on. Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to endorse the comments of my colleagues, in particular Bernadette, Phil and Kyle. Phil, in answer to your commentary, for me, the report exceeded our expectations, in particular the accuracy and clarity of what you had to say. One sort of overriding note that we haven't covered, I don't think, is that it's a very unfortunate fact that you usually need an event such as this in order to get funding to prevent an event such as this, and that the council had a conversation back in about 2018 where it determined where was it most exposed in terms of natural hazard, and it accurately concluded at that time that 10 inches of rain in the hills would be extraordinarily damaging for us, and that's where the increase in the height of the Taradale Stop Bank evolved from. And, you know, without that initiative, we could have been assessing New Zealand's worst ever disaster in terms of loss of life. And so I'm really just reinforcing the obvious component of your report, which is to say that our ability to do the things that you have accurately said we need to do is in a vast majority sense going to be delivered by how successful we are encouraging government to come on board with us in that initiative. And had we had that question been asked prior to Gabrielle, then we would be much, much less likely in that endeavour than we are now that we have seen the effects of Gabrielle. So that's my comment, and thank you very much for the report.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor McIntosh. Kia ora, Tanya.
As the councillors know, I'm the chair of the co-chair of the Regional Planning Committee, and I'm also from Tāmoe Marae. So I've got a whole range of emotions, a little bit like Jerf. I'll apologise in advance if it gets a bit emotional. But first up, I'm really pleased that the councillors had the foresight to commission this report. It's very welcomed and was very much needed. I'm grateful to the panellists. My background as a lawyer means I applaud nice, good, clear, set out reports, plain English, easy to read. And yours is really welcome from that perspective. I'm very grateful for all the work that you've done. I'm relieved to see that mana whenua have been heard. But I'm also upset and angry. And it took a cyclone, it took a report like this to highlight the inequities for our mana whenua, for the marae and papakainga and their whenua. But the report also goes wider than that and looks at the value of historical knowledge, which is amongst our communities. So I want to acknowledge the panellists for bringing these threads together in what is a very useful report. And despite the tears, I'm actually quite optimistic. We do have committed councillors who are up for tackling these issues. And I think we have territorial authorities who, local councils who truly appreciate the need for their communities to have these issues resolved, to give them comfort and confidence. But we've got a whole host of issues to deal with as council. And this report adds to the work that's already been done for coastal hazards and also for the future development strategy for Napier and Hastings. So it's really timely, and some of the recommendations really do dovetail and will have some not too small influence, I think, on the work that's been done elsewhere in council and amongst our other councils. I suppose I just wanted to leave with a comment, leave my views with my kōrero with you today with a comment that the anthropomorphic view, we humans think we can control nature, it's long outdated. And I think this report signals that. And so I welcome all those recommendations and just want to extend my aroha and gratefulness to the panel for the work that you've done, the report that you've produced, and the way that you did it.
Kia Kia ora, Tanya. Very emotional time for our communities and the council. With that, you can see our aroha to you, to the work that you've done, to all our communities. Are there many of us in this room who've been impacted? We've got manuhiri here. We've got staff and councillors.
And you, Chair.
So, you've laid down the Manuka branch, ko takoto de Manuka, which means this taonga we need to take on board, we need to absorb and work with our communities, as you say, Bernadette, in co-design. The legacy system issues that you've produced for us and the findings and the value in those findings, we take on wholeheartedly as a council. Nā reira. Tēnā koutou katoa. I hate to move into formalities, but we do have recommendations that we need to approve as a council today. So from 1 to 5, thank you, Councillor Williams, Councillor Foley. All those who agree say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those against, carried. To end with tikanga, as we started, I believe, Chair Phil, you have a presentation to make to us, and afterwards we join in together with Waiata, possibly with Karakia, to end, and then with Kai. Okay. So I'll hand it over to you, Phil, for the next stage, and Bernadette. Okay.
I think all it leaves us to do is to formally present you with our report. We've been touched. I don't think the people on the screen are the only folk that have sharing the emotion in this room. I would say that the process that we have been through has, in a lot of cases, been harrowing for us, but we're so grateful that people have shared it with us. So thank you.
I roto i ngā kupu o tāua waiata, whai a te māramatanga. E ki nei, A toki nui, taku toki, toki roa, taku toki, ko te toki nā tū tēnei toki. Ua, te mana ka hinga a tāne ka takoto te mānuka keiraro. E ngā mano i runga i raro tā whiwhi te toki nei ka pā te toki kei Hawaii, ka tapu, ka noa taua pūrongo, whiti, ora ki te whai au, ki te ao marama, e ngungu ki te pohatu, e ngungu ki te rākau, e ngungu ki te ahi, e ngungu ki te hau, e ngungu ki te wai. Wai ora, wai Māori, wai kino, wai mate, wai tai, ka piki, taku piki, i te au pikitanga o te māramatanga, whiti, eke, tau te Māori, haumi e, hui e. Tai e. Ati kei.
Kia mo te kai.
Ara kia mo te kai, au maha tiri ki runga nei, maro ki runga nei, hā ki raro nei, miti ana mai, kai ana mai, whakapakara ana mai, ko kōkina ka kai, ka whiu, ka makona, te rau tangata e, hui e.
Pai. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora.